Good morning, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this, the 9th meeting of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee in 2025. I've received apologies from Ruth Maguire this morning, so can I welcome Rona Mackay, who is attending as committee substitute. Good morning. Our first agenda item is for the committee to agree to take items 3 and 4 in private. Item 3 will be a discussion on the evidence that we're going to hear today, and item 4 is consideration of our draft annual report. Are the members content to take that in private? Excellent, I'm grateful. And our second agenda item is continuing consideration of the Scottish Parliament Recall and Removal of Members Bill at Stage 1. We are joined this morning by our first panel of 3 witnesses. And can I say good morning to Dr Ben Stanford, who's Senior Lecturer in Law from Liverpool John Moores University, who's joining us online. Good morning, Ben. To Dr Nick McCarroll, who's Senior Lecturer in Law at Glasgow Caledonian University, and to Professor Alistair Clark, Professor of Political Science at Newcastle University. I'm going to move straight to questions, and should any of the panellists wish to interrupt, then you can catch my attention or place R in the chat. And finally, can I say good morning to Graham Simpson, MSP, the sponsoring member with regard to this bill. And at certain points when he wishes, I'm more than happy to allow Graham to come in to ask questions and seek clarifications. If everyone's content with that, I will kick off the panel this morning by really just looking at the overarching purposes behind the bill. And to look at the circumstances under which an MSP can be removed from office during a parliamentary session, and whether or not what we have at present is too limited. So, is this bill necessary, and does it fulfil a quest that's asked? Dr Stanford, could I come to you first with that?
Good morning, and first of all, thank you for inviting me, especially remotely. In terms of the bill generally, I would say that yes, I would welcome and encourage such a bill, especially given events of the past 5-10 years, especially in Westminster, but obviously this spreads further than that. But returning some public confidence and accountability by allowing for recall in limited circumstances, I would certainly suggest that this is to be welcomed. And I guess that's why we're discussing this today.
Thank you. Alistair, can I come to you?
Yes, of course. I think this would be a significant bill were it passed in whatever form it's passed. Very important issue in addressing recall and removal. And I think it's always important to be considering matters of standards and conduct. And indeed, the bill, I think, has done us a service in bringing some of these issues to the fore again. Whether or not it would act as a deterrent, to my mind, is a bit unclear. And quite what the nature of the problem is also, to my mind, a bit unclear. The Parliament website tells us that we've had about 350 individual MSPs since 1999. And only apparently about 6 of those would have fallen foul of the requirements of this bill, which is less than 2%. So I think we're at danger of forgetting the fact that most MSPs do actually comply with conduct and standards requirements without any difficulty. That said, there are very clearly some loopholes, and I think this is one of the things that the bill really helps us to think through. So I'm not against the general purpose. I do wonder if the bill, as it stands, however, may create more problems than it actually resolves. Whether it would actually deal with public perceptions or actually make things worse. And I'm sure we're going to get into things like cost and all of those sorts of things. I think there's a very real danger of, first of all, voter confusion here, and also a very real danger of the costs of a regional poll being used to discredit the political process as well.
That's very helpful, as always. It's the detail that causes the problem. Nick, do you want to come in at the start?
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, I think the bill is required because I do think it fills a gap in terms of democracy because of the direct intervention that we can have of the people in this process, and it reflects what's going on in Westminster, as colleagues have said. The problem, I think, is that is introducing this within a representative democracy system. Because in Scotland and in Britain as a whole, there's not really a big tradition of direct democracy where people can hold politicians to account in a variety of different ways around the world. That doesn't really occur in our constitutional tradition. But I think it is good to have an element of that within our system. The real struggle is twofold, I think. Firstly, is how you combine that with a representative democracy system where we give a lot of power to our elected representatives, but also how we do it within our proportional parliament. And I think that some of the details and the tensions that I think perhaps are reflected in the bill are about those two phenomena: how you introduce direct democracy in a representative system and how you introduce it where we've got two types of election to the Scottish Parliament.
But you have no concern, or do you see any potential problem in that conflict between the methodology that was talked about in this bill, which is effectively direct, rather than the representative? Should we be concerned to say, actually, never let the two mix? Or are you confident that there is a scope for both?
I think Westminster has shown that there's a potential scope for both, although that has got its own problems. Right. The issue is, and I think it's reflected a little bit in the sanctions, in the reason that you would endorse sanctions. So, for example, you combine misconduct within parliamentary process and chambers with criminal actions. And misconduct within parliamentary chambers, you could argue, is more of an internal matter for Parliament. Whereas in some circumstances this would be involving the representatives, the MSPs, would be more inclined to take action on that and aware of the severity of it, rather than the general public. But we are asking the general public, if somebody behaves very badly in Parliament, in the most extreme circumstances, to have a say in it. However, more egregious behaviour, criminal behaviour, and to involve the people in that, I think, is quite a good thing. But it is a wee bit different to our normal representative process.
So there's a potential tension, and that as a committee we should look very closely at the triggering effects, because if we don't, there's a potential of causing a bigger problem with that conflict.
Not maybe a problem, but an overlap of two different visions of democracy, I think.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I suppose the follow-on, I mean, there are a number of other legislatures that use recall. I suppose, what would the highlights be for that? What are the ones out with Scotland and indeed out with the United Kingdom that already exist that perhaps we should pay attention to learn about some of the more detailed points? Ben, I'm happy to come to you first if you have a contribution.
Sure, thank you. So I suppose in America that's an obvious comparator here in some respect, but they really do go to town with recall petitions in some states. In many states, there is no kind of legal trigger. It's simply a matter of voters objecting to a legislature, their views, their general conduct. So the threshold is quite low. So I would suggest that going down that route is definitely to be avoided. We don't want recall petitions on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. That really would undermine the confidence and stability, I think, in the legislature. If we look at the Recall MPs Act, the UK example, so it's been around for 10 years now, and we've only had 4 by-elections, albeit there's been 6 petitions, 2 of which didn't, well, one, as you know, was stopped early, 1 did not lead to a by-election. So it's a matter of balance. Now, it's not a numbers game, it's quality rather than quantity, of course, but I would suggest keeping the scope really limited, as the Recall of MPs Act does, is definitely a starting point.
Thank you. Nick, come to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the tradition in not just in the United States of America, but the Americas is a big thing. In Latin America, the concept of holding politicians the right to recall on a variety of issues, mainly, as Ben's outlined, personal issues about the political differences with a representative. In our paper we outlined, Peru had 7,000 recall petitions within the course of a decade. Now you could argue that's largely down to polarisation within that society, but also with a flawed democratic process where elections are, didn't fulfil the problem, and there's an endless polarisation, which, I mean, as another aside, if you didn't have regulation in Britain, given we've had a number of polarising debates in Britain, if it became a substitute for elections, that would be a problem. It could lead to paralysis. I don't think we're anywhere near with this. But the recall process, which gave us Arnold Schwarzenegger as a governor, if you remember, in California as a phenomenon, because it was so personality-driven in terms of what the issue was, that was held because of a recall election, which was a surrogate for political disagreement. This isn't that, and there's a room for that, I think, but you would have to have a very different democratic structure than we have in Scotland or indeed in Britain.
Yeah, it's helpful. Alistair?
The thing that strikes me looking at this comparatively is actually how few recall systems there actually are. It's by far and away not a practice that most parliaments actually have. You've got to remember the Westminster context for the introduction of the 2015 Act was, of course, the expenses scandal. So, I mean, we've had nothing quite as bad as that by any manner of means here. Where recall seems to be more useful, or indeed more often applied, is at the kind of local level. So for local mayors and those kinds of things. And one of the key variations, well, there are two, I think, is whether this is focused on individuals or on an institution as a whole. So if there's a recall, then it's everybody out and then start again, or focused on a particular individual who has erred in some way or another. And the second is on the threshold by which a recall proceeds. A petition then goes forward to becoming a recall. And 10% comparatively quite low in that regard. I mean, there are one or two around that. Brandenburg in Germany, for instance, has 10%. But more normally, it tends to be higher than 10%. So I think there are these various things to factor in, but my main impression from looking at this is just how rare a recall system is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and I'm sure we'll explore in detail some of those items later. Sue, can I pass over to you?
I know we have covered a bit of this in some of the discussion already, and you've spoken about how the works in other countries, the recall process, but this bill that Graham's introducing broadly seeks to replicate the principles and designs of the Recall of MPs Act 2015. And so does the experience to date of how that Act has worked in practice suggest that it's a good approach? And I know Dr Stanford had said that there'd only been 4 by-elections and 6 petitions. So maybe if I come straight to yourself, Dr Stanford, if that's okay.
Sure, thank you. So with the 2015 Act, there was definitely some early scepticism. Some people thought the threshold was going to be too high, so it would be ineffective. Some people thought that there was going to be pressure groups that would simply seek to oust MPs for, spurious reasons. But obviously the first petition, we can't really say it failed because it was an expression of the will of the voters not to trigger the mechanism, not to reach the 10% threshold. So we can't say it failed on that basis. That's simply what the people wanted to do. But there are obviously failures in a practical perspective with that first petition. Not enough polling stations, for example, the opening hours, that sort of thing. But I think after that, with the subsequent petitions, they did address that to some extent. So, yeah, I would say that 4 by-elections and 6 petitions, I think that's a healthy number. It's showing that it works. Obviously, there were many other MPs that very narrowly avoided being subject to a petition. They resigned just before a suspension would be recommended and so on. But yeah, I would say overall, it's been successful. There's been some problems. They've been addressed to some extent. Some of them might have to be considered with this bill. For example, an appeals mechanism. Obviously, the criminal route for triggering a recall petition. There are appeals in the courts, but for the other mechanisms to activate the trigger, to activate the recall petition, there may need to be some appeal mechanisms considered for that.
Do you think, Dr Stanford, if you said there's a number of resignations before the petitions are the by-election is all triggered, do you think that therefore is acting as a deterrent? When I say deterrent, you know what I mean. It's like it's a cost containment mechanism almost, because they know the game's up. To be quite blunt.
Well, I suppose every MP that has experienced that will have their own answer to that question. But yeah, I would suggest it's suggested, is it maybe a case of jumping before being pushed?
Yeah, okay. Dr McCarroll.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think there is a need for it in the sense that I think we're in an era where politicians in general are viewed sceptically, and to involve the people in any way, I think, is a good thing to speak about and to do. The problem is how you engage that in a practical way. And I think that has happened to a degree in Westminster, but the varying results of them probably are to do with, if you're asking the general populace to intervene in this issue, how bought in are they? Alistair mentioned the MP scandal, which was the outrage that the general public felt, and a number of jail sentences did emerge from that from MPs. But there might be other issues that are perhaps more esoteric, even though it's a serious issue perhaps within the Parliament, that might not gain the sort of same momentum amongst the public to have their say on it. So that's an issue, but I think that's more because we've got this two-stage that there has to be some sort of sanction beforehand. That's something I think MSPs would consider before they sanctioned politicians in that way.
And in terms of lessons learned, I suppose, from the Westminster process, Professor Clark?
Well, there have certainly been issues in the implementation, I think, of the Westminster process. I mean, it makes sense to use that as the basis for going forward and thinking here. There's obviously a model that has been deployed. It's certainly obvious to do that for the first past the post element of the additional member system. I think, as I'm sure we'll get into, it's more problematic for the regional list aspect of the system. I would say a few things just about the operation of the Westminster system. Obviously, you've heard about issues around when they close the petition, how long it should be open for, those kinds of things. And I think the committee has been talking about those sorts of issues. There has been an issue with the actual level of sanction that potentially causes a recall petition. So there was debate in, I think it was the Ferrier case, and whether or not the sanction that would be awarded would be more than 10 days or less than 10 days. Yeah. So I think this has the potential to affect members' decisions on those parliamentary sanctions going forward. A couple of other things I would point to. It's easier to achieve 10% in a fairly small electorate than it is in a big electorate, if that makes sense. So, the nature of the constituency matters. And I think there have been 6 petitions. I think they've been relatively low turnout by-elections when they have come. I think on average, I calculated, it was 45%. I mean, the only comparator from Scotland we have was Rutherglen and Margaret Ferrier, which I think was 37%. So the idea that they engage the public, I'm afraid I'm not quite sure really stands up in either of these cases, unfortunately.
That's okay. I get that as well. And I think I noticed in your written submission, Dr Stanford, you said that there's the recall process and triggering that could be open to abuse, when what can be considered a good reason for absence, if we look at that one, because you said such a move would need considerable safeguards to protect against highly concentrated pressure groups with vested interests. And I think we all feel those on a regular basis, and that seems to be how the world is working right now. So in terms of the proposed criteria for triggering the recall process, do you think it's appropriate? And you've already mentioned a wee bit there, Dr Clark, about the thresholds being set, and maybe should other criteria be set to balance it all out? Can I come to yourself again, Dr Stanford, first before?
So on the question of non-attendance, I think because that's one of the inclusions in the bill here. I would ask, why is this considered to be automatic disqualification rather than activating a recall petition? That was just a question that came to mind initially there, because as far as I know, obviously at the local council level, that's already in place, or something similar is in place, I believe. But at in the national legislatures, and certainly in Westminster, equivalents are hard to find for that sort of thing. So I just wondered why it would be considered automatically disqualifying rather than leading to a recall petition. Was that a policy decision? Something I just thought I'd ask.
That's helpful. We can maybe, when we have the member taking questions from us so later on, we can ask him that. Not for today. Does either of the other panellists want to come in on sort of any other criteria and that could be added, and/or thresholds that probably need to be considered?
Yeah, well, I think the pressure groups issue is if you gave a power to the public generally to recall their representatives, that, which isn't the route that Westminster's gone down or that this bill goes down, that would come to the fore much more in terms of organised groups, as has happened, as did happen in many states in America, that has this process. There's, as recently as 2021 in America, there was one on the issue of trade union negotiation rights. So the trade union movement actually coordinated a recall petition in Wisconsin over the governor, because they could do that on a policy issue. That's not promoted here, but the issues might be perhaps the attendance might lead to that because of the political dispute with the representative.
Professor Clark.
I've no real issues with the triggers. I mean, I mentioned the 10-day one because that has been seen to potentially affect behaviour at Westminster. But if you set that at 15 days, you would have the same problem. So, you know, to some degree, that's a bit of an arbitrary decision. I think it's worth being aware of the potential consequences of setting it at any particular point. Yeah. But I'm not quite clear what you can do about it, because there will at some point be a need to decide.
Yes, I accept that. So that's fine. I'm happy with those. Convener?
Excellent. Just to explore the sort of 10% level, which has been mentioned in a couple of answers. I mean, obviously the 10% reflects what Westminster chose, and then you can look at the first past the post constituency and say there's a parity there. Is it worth us looking, because of the difference in the electoral methodologies here in Scotland to send people to this place, that perhaps 10% is not the correct figure? And what is it that we should look to try and decide what that correct figure should be? I don't know who wants to. Alistair, do you want to kick off? And then...
It's a very good question. I mean, I think you'd need to look at population size comes to mind. Islands come to mind, and the nature of those as constituencies. I think it gets harder when you're thinking about regions, and I think we'll talk about the balance within the regions as we go on. I mean, I think ultimately it's going to be a policy decision one way or the other, if it's 10% or 15 or whatever it happens to be. But it just strikes me that 10% is actually low comparatively. And whether that would, you know, raising it would prevent petitions being successful or not, I think is unclear to me. It might not. But
should we look at the connection between, because you raised the turnout at by-elections at somewhere between sort of 32 up to 45, depending on what it is, and they are, compared to certainly full elections, very small turnouts. And yet we have the 10% that's triggering that. Is there a merit in looking at the connection between those two figures, or actually should we just look at it separately as a policy decision on 10% and the reality of the enthusiasm or otherwise for by-elections?
Yeah, I think it's a different issue. I mean, I think you're asking the electorate a different thing, really, in terms of the revision, and that requires some form of public education as well, in terms of the nature of recalls, which are relatively rare. As I said, I know I've only been in our constitutional system for a decade, so people people's knowledge of it, even the process of something being open for several weeks to register a vote or your position, is something that's pretty unique in our democratic system. So the 10%, I see the logic behind it. I don't think you can really measure it alongside electoral interventions.
So we keep that, the election period, the by-election, as a separate discussion from a policy point of view from that electoral activity, which would be the petition.
Well, yeah, although I think there's broader issues about the regional.
Yeah, I think we'll come to that. Sort of really looking at the constituency and the 10%. Ben, is there anything that you want to add to that?
Just a couple of quick points. Obviously, there's been a very gradual decline in turnout in UK general elections over the past few decades. So I would think that setting the threshold high is not a good option. Whether 10% is too low, yeah, maybe it is, perhaps. But by-elections turnout always pretty poor, as has been discussed already. But I would also just say that this 10% threshold, it's not to remember that activating the recall petition with this 10%, it's not ousting the MSP or MP. It's merely activating and giving way to a by-election, potentially. So, yeah, I don't think it should be any lower, definitely not. Whether it should be higher, possibly a little bit, but, you know,
a policy
there's
decision.
no easy answer. Policy decision.
That's helpful. And the other thing that I picked up was the sort of the indicators that could prompt this. Do we need to be careful about or do we need to recognise the difference between what are potentially political decisions to seek to oust an MSP and actually the more moral, agreed understanding that the imprisonment for a period of a year already exists? There are measures of identifying that. What is the tension between those internal Scottish Parliament consequences that could lead to it and the external ones? And what level of care do we need to put into place if we're going to pull in our internal behaviour into an external result?
I think Alistair's made the point. I think it would probably temper what punishment you gave politicians for breaking the rules of Parliament, because if you believe the consequences of the punishment that you issue to an MSP could result in them being recalled, that's something to bear in mind. And in terms of disrupting the Parliament, relatively early on in the Parliament's history, the Scottish Socialist Party had a group of MSPs who disrupted the Parliament over the issue of the G8 protests, and they were suspended by Parliament, by the committees, for a month. It was the longest ever suspension at that time, one of the longest ever in the history of the Parliament. That could result in them all facing recall petitions as it stands, and their crime was to disrupt Parliament. Now, you could argue, and a lot of the rhetoric at the time was, well, this is a democratic institution, these are politicians, you shouldn't be disrupting it, so they need a punishment. Should their punishment be they face a by-election or a recall petition, is a political question as well. So, whereas if you disrupted Parliament, say somebody was suspended, I think a Labour MSP was suspended for a day for shouting at the presiding officer, the consequences of that are not as great, but as a punishment. So, I think it would the effect it would have would be on the way that you punish MSPs for their behaviour in Parliament, or their behaviour in terms of acting as a paid lobbyist if they ask questions about something. Do you think that is beyond the idea of they've breached their roles as parliamentarian? That's something more broader that the public should have a say on, or is it as an internal matter? So I suppose my question is that something that we should consider from the point of view of this bill? Or, if this bill becomes law, is that something that should be considered internally within the Parliament with regard to its procedures? Well, I think it would probably link in, because if you set a 10-day, if an MSP is suspended for more than 10 days, you would know that whenever you're punishing them. That's the consequence of that, a potential consequence of that. So it might lead you to think, well, we won't go that far, but we think there should be this sanction.
Alistair?
It's a reasonably simple answer. Internally, I think standards processes have the potential always to be politicised, and I think there are established procedures in how these are dealt with already in the Scottish Parliament. I think that's the way to be dealing with it. I do think it is really a matter for internal procedures, standing orders, and so on.
So make it a separation at that point. Yes. Ben, anything to add?
Well, the Westminster experience here definitely suggests that the suspension route, the parliamentary sanction route, is the most political and most problematic. The two examples that come to mind are Boris Johnson and Owen Paterson, who really objected to the process, and I think Boris Johnson called it a kangaroo court, the committee that made the decision. So there was a lot of questions about natural justice and a political decision-making body, which in some ways has been addressed with the creation of the independent expert panel that allows appeals. So I would just ask whether that's something that is possible or should be possible for this bill, a route of appeal, essentially.
Thank you. Emma. Sorry, Graham, is there anything you want to come on at this stage?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, it was just on that point. If this is the committee that is dealing with these matters, do you think that this committee, when it's dealing with such issues, should have lay members, as they do in Westminster and I think in Wales?
Is that a comment about your bill or this committee?
No.
more than happy to take the flavour of the panel. Alistair?
Yep, I'll take that one. Having looked into standards at Westminster, where there are lay members on both houses' standards committees, there are also on the Independent Parliamentary Standards Speakers Committee and so on. So there is experience of how they work in standards regimes. My feeling is that they've improved some of the debate around these things and brought different voices to the standards issues. I don't think it's been... well, let's put it this way. I think it's probably taken time to bed down into how it operates, but that's inevitable with any new procedure. But my gut feeling is that they've improved the standards process, and importantly, I think they avoid the issue of MSPs, MPs, whoever marking their own homework.
Any other comments?
No, it wasn't. It's quite an interesting. That would be an interesting.
A discussion for another time,
yeah.
possibly. Actually, that's helpful. Emma, can I come to you?
Thank you, Convener. The primary objective of a recall process must be to improve the accountability between elected representatives and the voters. Do you think that this bill places enough emphasis on that?
In the sense of.
In looking at the different systems that are proposed, do they provide a strong enough link between?
I think one of the issues which we haven't discussed yet, but about that link is the distinction of constituency representatives at a local level and regional levels, and the link between regional identity and voters is obviously more remote, much bigger areas, and a different sort of electoral system. So I think there is a problem in the bill in terms of trying to replicate a form of recall in that system. I don't think it's unsalvageable. I think we could do it, but I think the proposal in the bill of having a vote, essentially, do you support the right of recall of a regional one, then removing them, doesn't get that balance right in terms of democracy. As far as our paper thinks, we think it's better to go directly to an electoral input at a regional level, because it's the only way for that size of constituency that you could have that input in a meaningful way. Now, the point I think you're touching on is the difficult then becomes much more ostensibly a political action rather than about the right of recall. But I think that might be the compromise you have to make, given the size of the area and the form of electoral system that we have in the Scottish Parliament.
And that does sacrifice the proportionality that the voting system encourages.
Exactly. And that is a problem, I think, as we touch on in our paper, that it's broader than this bill. It's about the nature of proportional systems combined with the first past the post. And again, you'll all have experiences of your colleagues in councils that have a single transferable vote system, but by-elections occur regularly and really become a first past the post outcome, albeit done in a transferable vote. So an interesting thing, probably again beyond the scope of the bill, would be to try and combine something like that in a regional vote. But that's a detail, but it's more the fundamental principle I think you've touched on between that balance, proportionality, the involvement of the public, election versus recall, and I think all of those issues have to be looked at when we look at the regional vote.
Yeah, I found your written evidence interesting because you suggest about holding a full election in the region for replacing a recalled regional member. And my reflection on that was that's looking at the first past the post element and trying to transpose it into the regional element.
Yeah.
And I wonder, have you given any consideration to doing it the other way around? And in maintaining the proportionality, moving the regional element onto the constituency, given the winner of a constituency puts the same amount onto the divisor for a party as a previous list seat does.
Right, so you mean that you would have at the constituency level an electoral impact rather than, so you wouldn't
replace based on proportionality? Because currently in the bill, the regional recalled member is replaced
by the person. Yeah. Sorry, just on the proportionality as well. The point we're making on that, proportionality is a vital part of the Scottish Parliament, but it is a snapshot. The proportionality that we had in the election in 2016 reflects the political view at that time. If you move to a by-election, that could shift. There might be a different political mood at the time. But we think it's a clearer way to do it at a regional level because of that lack of local identity, like constituency vote.
Yeah.
Thanks. Can I just be clear? If you were having a regional reinstatement poll, there is no way of having proportionality on that. It would be a yes-no vote, quite simply. So it's in effect 50% of the electorate that happened to go and vote that day that are the ones, you just can't have that. Now, if you were having a regional by-election, even if you were running that under some form of, and I've seen this proposal for using the single transferable vote as we do in local government elections, it would still need to be a majoritarian basis under which that member was elected, for the simple reason that you're only electing one member. You can't have proportionality if you're only electing one member. You can if you have more.
Yes, but if you are...
Sorry, I think Ben wants to contribute as well. Ben,
thank you. Thank you. Just a quick point there, because this really does raise the question on recall in general. Is this about punishing the individual or punishing the party or a bit of both? Because the Westminster experience, 3 out of 4 by-elections following recall led to a change in party, sometimes overturning pretty big majorities. So applying that knowledge here to the regional MSP situation, if you're replacing an MSP with the next person on the list, the same party, that's going to potentially risk undermining public confidence if they really do want to oust the MSP and the party holding that seat. They don't have a choice there, as far as I'm aware. It's simply the next person on the list. So it's merely going to be punishing the individual, whilst the party, if they are responsible in any way, are kind of off the hook, as it were.
Yeah, that was my point earlier around proportionality. If a recalled regional member fails the yes-no vote, their party, if there's still a representative left on the list, still retains that proportionality overall?
I mean, I think that's the standard way for dealing with casual vacancies under the proportional system. I don't see any problem with doing that whatsoever.
But when we're looking at creating parity between the two systems, the constituency elections at the time of the election decide who wins seats on the list to the same degree as the list seats do. So should we be looking at proportionality being retained across the board?
Well, you should, but I think that would be being done if the next member for that party comes forward. I'm not sure I really understand the question. Broad proportionality would be in effect maintained. You have it's one member after all. And, if you're just replacing the next member for that party, then proportionality is maintained.
But on the constituency side, a different party may win that by-election.
Undoubtedly, but that's not always been the outcome of the recall process. One seat was held by the original party, so that's not an inevitable outcome.
No. I think another problem about having a regional vote, which is essentially yes, no, do you back it? It's quite confusing given for the public in terms of what actually they're being asked to do, and that's the broader thing, making the public education about this process much more difficult in a broader, big constituency, particularly with the islands, the rural areas in Scotland, and that the ability to get to stations to actually register your problem. So. And it will be very expensive as well, which obviously democracy versus expense is not something that you should generally look at because we believe in democracy. But there is a lot of expense for that one-off vote that would be quite difficult to comprehend for lots of people. So one way around that would be to go directly to the electoral route because people at least understand that and there's a machinery around it. We would lose the proportionality in that moment of that election, but the democracy element would be there. But you're juggling about 3 or 4 different things in that regional vote, which the right to recall is clearer in a first-past-the-post system than it is in that one.
If the winner of a region-wide by-election were to resign during that session, how do you propose that we would replace them?
There'd been a recall, somebody had won the election and they then stood down.
So they weren't there from a list, so there's no...
There would have to be another by-election.
Okay.
I assume.
Emma, just before you move on to that, I think, Sue, you've got a question just on this point.
Yeah, it's just on, do you think there's any harm? I mean, the regional representatives, which many of us are elected in quite a different way, and we accept that. Well, we should accept it, frankly. So do you think it should be fair enough to have different mechanisms for recall for a regional and a first-past-the-post?
Simply, yes. You're elected under different rules, constituency or regional list rules. While I understand the desire to have some degree of parity and so on, you're not elected under parity rules, I'm afraid. And so
you don't need to apologise, Alex.
No, but it follows then that there should be no need for that to be part of the recall process. And I think the difficulty is we're trying to shoehorn a first-past-the-post system here into a regional list process, which, I'm sure we'll go into more detail, but is at best problematic. And there is an established way of dealing with casual vacancies already in relation to regional list MSPs if someone decides to resign. And it seems to me that reinventing the wheel at potentially great cost is something perhaps best avoided.
Yeah, okay. I like the term casual vacancies. I'm enjoying that. Dr McCarroll and Ben, if you've got anything further to add.
In principle, there's nothing wrong with treating the regional list differently. The problem is, what do you want the right to recall for? Is it just something that's different for different politicians, or is it about something more fundamental in terms of democracy, holding politicians to account? Ben said holding parties to account potentially, which wouldn't be resolved if somebody was further down the list. What's the purpose of it? And if the purpose is democracy and having the people have a say on something, then I think what we've concluded, on balance, is probably better, if you're going to do it on a regional one, to do that in a direct electoral way, like you would do with a constituency, than have a vote, yes or no, do you want the next person on this list to get the seat, essentially, which would cause its own problems.
Thank you. Ben, Dr Stanford. And then
Thank you. Yeah, I would just re-emphasise what I said before. Not giving voters the opportunity to essentially choose for a regional MSP being replaced is really, really problematic. And the simplest thing that voters will understand is having an election, having a choice, whereas an MSP being replaced by the next person on the list might simply appear like a deal done in a smoky boardroom behind the scenes, even though obviously that person was on the list at the previous election, so we'll know roughly who it is. Still, it's going to give the impression of the public being disengaged and apart from the process.
A warning for us then. Thank you, Convener.
Emma, come in.
There's disagreement then on this point. And Professor Clark, can I just return to your previous answer, because I want to clarify if you're saying the vacancy should just be triggered, there shouldn't be another step involved when a regional member is recalled?
You could have, the bill foresees a two-step model. You could have a one-step model where it's just that it goes to petition, it's assumed if that passes, then replaced. My gut feeling is, again, that's unnecessary. I think there is a procedure for dealing with vacancies. What it would mean is that the standards process would probably need to adapt to cope with anything that came through. But I don't think it's necessary that you do have a process where you go back to the electorate. And I disagree strongly about the point about voter confusion. I would just point out that, again, casual vacancies are already replaced by the next member on the list. So this is an already established procedure that doesn't seem to have caused any difficulties up until now.
I suppose people aren't used to having a role in that process, though, as it stands. And if it were yes, no, there might not be that appreciation that you're not saying no to that party.
Definitely. I think there's a very important point here, which is that as things stand, voters are being asked to do different things, potentially, if we go down the two-stage route. Because the first time they're being asked to sign a petition for recalling that particular MSP. So they go, they sign, and then, of course, then they're asked to come back again. And in order to give the view, well, yes and no, as far as the bill stands at the moment. And I think there is the potential for voter confusion here. Let's remember, we have had difficulties with voter confusion in Scotland in 2007 when we redesigned ballot papers and led to large numbers of rejected ballots. So I think we want to do what we can to minimise voter confusion rather than potentially increase it.
So one thing that has been raised with the committee is the potential for the initial signing of a recall petition being a yes-no question. And perhaps that could be a single stage for a regional member, because then you are proving not only a 10% threshold, but a majority of those who voted want that person out, and then maybe you wouldn't have to go back to the electorate.
I think that's a reasonable suggestion in the sense that it just involves a one-stage process and thereby minimises difficulties. I can see difficulties in how that is calculated and how that 10% is calculated. But I think, there are also potentially ballot secrecy issues here as well. And I think some of your earlier witnesses have raised that. If you go to a signing station, as things stand at the moment, you're very obviously going to sign to remove that particular member. I think if it was a yes-no petition, then that's removed because you're maintaining that sort of secrecy. No one can actually know what you're going to do in that signing station. But again, you need to be careful about how you ended up deciding it, how you would add those yeses and nos or subtract them and so on. I mean, these are details to be worked out, I would guess, in secondary legislation. But I think it's got potential.
Yeah, that's an interesting point on the yes-no, because as it stands, recall, there's quite a lot of secrecy about media reporting and coverage of the whole issue because of the issue that Alistair said, that it would look like perhaps promoting it if you record it's going on and where it's going on, whereas yes-no would maybe be one form of resolution of that.
Yeah. I think that's covered everything.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Ben, can I just come to your previous comment in relation to concern the electorate would have of not having a choice? And it goes back to the question of who's being punished or what is the role of recall. Is it about a individual MSP, irrespective of how they come to this Parliament, acting or having a behaviour that is unacceptable and leading to it? Or is it about punishing a political party? Do you have any confidence that if this process was very specifically and openly about dealing with a MSP whose behavioural choices are such that they shouldn't represent people, that challenge about an electorate just wanting to punish a political party is less of a concern? Or is it just so intertwined that we can't differentiate those two things?
I think it is very difficult to separate the two with a representative democracy, especially MPs if they are the party in government. As we know, in by-elections, MPs who represent a party in government get quite heavily punished quite often. Recent experience shows that. But yeah, I don't think there's an easy way to separate that. And that's just something that perhaps we have to accept, that voters will use it as an opportunity to punish the party, unless the behaviour of the individual in question is so egregious and terrible that the voters will punish that voter. I don't think they can separate persons and parties easily. There is no easy way to separate that.
Thank you. Annie, can I come to you?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. It's been very interesting listening to all this, and I think we've heard quite a bit from other panels as well. But my sort of question's about the practicalities of signing the petition. So it's like, how do we know we've got the right amount of places to do it, the right amount of time, and about how do we make sure electoral fraud isn't committed as well? So it's more about the practicality, and I think it was Dr Stanford at the beginning had said about not enough places to sign, especially if you look at the islands and stuff like that as well. So can I come to Dr Stanford first, just about the practicalities?
Okay, thank you. So the UK experienced the first the first recall petition, North Antrim, Northern Ireland. I believe that was quite problematic because of the signing polling stations. There wasn't enough and the opening hours were problematic. But I think in the subsequent ones, with the increase in the number of polling stations, that did address it to some extent. And I believe in this bill, is it a maximum of 10 polling stations to be open in a constituency? Is that a typical number compared to parliamentary elections or by-elections, or is that fewer than normal? I'm not entirely sure, to be honest.
We've heard evidence. It's fewer in number, and one of the things that we've heard evidence about, and obviously we're inquiring about, is the locations of the petition signing are frequently very different from the polling stations. It would appear people have a very strong connection to their polling station. They know it even between elections, And one of the challenges is knowing where the petitions can be signed. That's what we've heard so far.
Yeah, I suppose it's about that point. The petition is a different thing to an election. And so if you're going somewhere different, then even psychologically, you know, well, I'm doing something different here than participating in an election. So that might be a useful thing. But I think the geography of Scotland, particularly is the Highlands and Islands and rural areas, there are issues about accessibility, which we deal with in electoral terms. But if we're minimising that for the recall, that would be problematic if that comes up. So having a set number might be a problem there. You might need more in a more rural area. So that flexibility perhaps could be reflected in the bill.
Just to add to that, I mean, there are, even for normal elections, problems in recruiting staff to man polling stations and those kinds of things. So, assuming that people will be recruited to do this, then that adds another logistical difficulty. It's unclear. The policy memorandum seems to suggest that places like polling stations, schools and so on might be used as signing stations. My gut feeling is that's probably not going to be the case. There's going to need to be thought around other locations. Now, as the convener just rightly mentioned, people get very attached to the polling station. They know where to go and that kind of thing. I think there is a danger that if it's not the polling station and they've got to go to X council building at between such and such a time, it starts to get confusing. Now, that potentially starts to put people off to begin with. Now, I think there's a broader question here in regard to the electoral register, because in a polling station you have, in normal elections, you have the register there for that polling station. Now, are we actually thinking here about people being allocated to one particular signing station, or being able to go to any of the 10 signing stations in that constituency? Because if it's any of the 10 signing stations in the constituency, there's a job for the electoral registration officers to do in being able to make a bigger register available to people who are actually manning those stations. And that problem gets magnified even more when you're talking about regions as well. So I think there's a knock-on problem, not just in terms of the locations, but also in terms of the registers, because wherever you choose and however you choose to do it has implications for the electoral registration, which comes back to have implications for the question you raised about signing fraud and all of those sorts of things. So I think this is very much a crucial decision.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. I'm happy, convener. Thank you.
Thank you. So just following on from that, in a sense, the other part of all of this in respect is money spent. Certainly some of the petitions that we've seen at Westminster, parties have put enormous resource into ensuring that the 10% is reached. Is that something that we need to take account? I mean, obviously it may not be dealt with in primary legislation, but there is a question of how much money you throw at. And I think some of the examples that you've said from the US, where those that have backed the petitions have the level of resource, they've achieved changes that might not otherwise have occurred. What level of credence, thought should we give to that at this stage? Nick, come to you first.
I think cost is a big issue in terms of how political parties intervene. Also, the general process of cost as well, and keeping places open to signatures for 4 weeks is a significant expense in terms of staffing and so on. I suppose the detail will be, as it's not an election, it's a recall petition, and that's reflected, as I say, in reporting restrictions that we currently have on the petition, is probably we'd need specific rules about costs and expenditure, which we do have in elections, obviously, but even in elections it's difficult to regulate those. Perhaps it'd be more straightforward to regulate in the sense that it would be one specific geographical area, so you could keep closer tabs on it. But it is problematic in the sense that if one seat comes up, then resources could be focused on it by groups inevitably, because it's a straightforward area that you could focus on.
And also the challenge in the sense that where there's a petition, it may be difficult to identify who's doing the advertising and the leafleting to urge people to. Alistair?
I'd agree entirely with that. I'd say it's, I mean, there's an assumption in the policy memorandum that this is not really going to be an issue. I disagree strongly with that. Give political parties a contest to fight, and they'll fight it. And they'll fight it in a positive and in a negative sense. The parties will fight to keep the representative, but others will fight to unseat them. And I think that's an important dynamic that's really not recognised in the assumptions behind the bill. So,
and not one that we're used to in our democracy at the moment, really.
Absolutely not. And I think it's one that we need to think of. And I mean, I share Nick's concern about the potential targeting of resources here as well, because these would be one-off processes. And what we know about that is that they can attract these sorts of, campaigns.
Ben?
Just one point to add. I believe the 2015 Act does have spending limits in it in some kind, so it's definitely worth considering. But apart from that, I've not got much else to say on that.
That's fine, thank you. I'm going to pass over to Rona now.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd like to ask questions about non-attendance and the criteria for disqualification. So clearly, there's a big difference between being disqualified for misconduct or receiving a custodial sentence. Professor Clark, in your submission, you say physical non-attendance at least once in 180 days seems like a low bar for an MSP to meet. And you go on to say that consideration of changing and updating the code of conduct to deal with this would seem to avoid the need for legislation. So I guess my question is the bill too open about what criteria is needed for this? I'm thinking about physical or mental health is so different from, somebody having committed an offence or misconduct. So do you think this should be laid out in the bill, exactly what the criteria for that non-attendance should be?
No, I'll be clear. I don't think that should be in the bill, full stop. I think this is to do with how MSPs, work, basically, how you all do your work. And I'm sure there are 129 different ways of you all, executing the various roles that you have. One of the difficulties here, I think, is there is no clear job description for an MSP. And that makes it difficult to hold anyone to a particular standard. Should someone's job description be in primary legislation? I'm less clear that it should be, for the simple reason that it then opens the door for other aspects of MSP's roles to be dragged into primary legislation as well. And I'm really not sure we need to be doing that. I think it's. And you may disagree as a standards committee, but to my mind, it would be preferable for the Code of Conduct somehow to be amended to deal with this as an issue. However you decide that attendance should be dealt with. I would just note, I mean, obviously attendance physically is not the only way that people can do jobs now. As we've seen during the pandemic, remote attendance, remote ways of doing jobs are other ways. So I think there's a discussion in the policy memorandum about trying to measure meaningful participation in parliamentary procedures. And I think that kind of thing is something that at least the committee might consider, but I would strongly suggest that this is not in primary legislation for all of those reasons.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Stanford, you're, I think, of similar mind to Professor Clark. You're saying such a move would need considerable safeguards to protect against pressure groups with vested interests, and you'd require clear evidence of an MSP's protracted absence without reasonable cause for Parliament. And I guess I'm a bit confused as to where the lines between being off on, say, sick leave for physical or mental health comes with not being physically able to come to Parliament for 180 days. And I'm wondering if the bill doesn't set that out clearly enough.
I would say, first of all, that I think expecting an MSP to attend just once in 180 days is not a big ask. And obviously, once you factor in the recess days as well, the reality it's going to be much more than that. It's going to be more than 200 days, I imagine, to expect an MSP to attend. But having said that, yeah, there does need to be considerable safeguards here. And in the bill, it has the provision for Parliament itself to be given an opportunity to vote, for the MSP to give representations. So there definitely are some safeguards in place, but I would say they're absolutely necessary. So yeah, I can't add much more than that.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. McKerrow?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's whether you think the bill should go there at all.
Yeah,
I think I'm probably in line with Alistair. I'm not sure it should, because indirectly you're getting into a whole debate about the modern workplace and virtual attendance versus actual attendance. I mean, in my workplace, my university, there's a big debate around that. Lecturers are a group that are required to be in person. We were told we've got to do all our classes face-to-face. Other jobs are not. That's another debate, not really what the bills want to look at. But I think the problem is, if you've got somebody that's really at it and there's a minimum standard, they just meet the minimum standard. They'd come in for 2 days and then not be there for the next month. Yeah. So when you set a standard, that's what can happen if you had somebody of that category. However, I do understand why it's there, in the sense that it's a very basic recall that your representative isn't doing the job, i.e. they're not there. But I think there might be better routes, ironically, given the right of recall, than this for somebody that's just not attending. I think there's other methods. So
currently councillors are subject to this rule, aren't they? And I can't remember how many times they have to attend in the year.
Yeah, and that, I think that occurs. They just clock in for it.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the other issue, does the bill provide enough safeguards for confidentiality and the privacy of MSPs who may have complex reasons for not being there? And this maybe goes back to should this be in the bill at all? I'm sensing that you're maybe all of a similar mind about how, who judges this? What's the criteria, and who judges whether that person should be disqualified? It's clear cut in other issues, obviously, if it's misconduct or custodial sentence, etc. But someone being absent, who judges whether somebody's at it? Basically, I think is what I'm saying, and that's problematic. I don't think there's a clear answer to that, but maybe it should be looked at to be defined a little more clearly in the bill. I'm sensing that none of you have a clear answer to it. No. Okay, right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I suppose following on from that, I mean, that the absence one is an example of a potentially sort of political internal behavioural choice that MSPs make. And I sense, I think there's not strong disagreement, but that there is a range from the panel on whether or not that should or should not be included into as a trigger for a recall process. Someone is bound to suggest to me this, so I'm going to seek your independent of this place's view. And actually it goes back to, in part, what Emma was talking about of proportionality. What happens if an MSP chooses to change their political party or indeed leave their political party? Is that something that, or indeed may be expelled by their political party? I have to take the entire view of it. Is that something that this bill should consider? Or again, is that something that actually the internal mechanisations that work in this place should deal with?
I think that we actually we had the discussion about this with my colleagues, but because that is a gap, because it's one thing that people say, or politicians often say, if you go in another party, there should be an automatic by-election, etc. Except every political party has benefited from that, and every party has suffered from it. So the rhetoric changes depending on the position that you're on. It does touch on Emma's point over proportionality, because it does shift the proportionality of a parliament if somebody decides to choose another party, and there is no recall for that. At one level, you could see that should be an area that you go into. I understand perhaps why it's not there, because it would raise a lot of other issues. But again, if it's about political representation in relationship to the people, if somebody changes political allegiance after being voted in, that should be in the sort of the theory of recall one of the reasons to do it. But there's lots of, I think that raises lots of other issues that I'm not sure how you would touch on that in law in terms of that.
Alistair, if I come to you and then Ben.
Tis always been thus, basically. There have always been people who have changed parties. I think that's really something for the Parliament to deal with internally.
And Ben?
Yeah, not much to add apart from in 2020 in Westminster, an MP did try and put forward a private member's bill to add this to the Recall of MPs Act, but it didn't go anywhere. So, yeah, I've got nothing to add apart from that.
No, that's very, very kind. Great. Graham, is there anything that you want to raise before I let these good people...
Convener, it's been a superb session. I mean, I think the questions have been great. We've covered a lot of ground, and I've been fascinated to hear the views of the academics. And I was just reflecting, if you don't mind me giving us a small anecdote. I've been working on this for a long time now, and at the start of the process, I did attempt to reach out to Arnold Schwarzenegger through his office, but I could. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't, because I couldn't get him to contribute. I think there were issues at that time with the recall process in California, so Arnie was keeping stum. Convener, I just want to ask one question, if I may, and it's to yourselves, Nick and Alistair, just on this non-attendance issue, because you've both got strong views on that. So given your views, are you also suggesting that we scrap the law, because it is a matter of law, for councillors who don't attend for 6 months? Because the law is, if they don't attend for 6 months, it can go to a vote of the council. And this has happened several times in Scotland. So are you suggesting we also scrap that law?
Maybe it's I'm not sure the wording of it, but it should perhaps, maybe it has been raised as debate about the nature of work and how a councillor is measured as doing their work. I think is it attendance at full council meetings. I think it's not committed. So I mean that's a very specific. So she said somebody has to attend. You probably wouldn't want to. You have to attend First Minister's questions every week. If you don't attend that, then that would be the equivalent in a way. There'd have to be some plenary that somebody's never attending, and in Parliament and councils there could be a slightly different measurement of that. Perhaps I think that's the logic of why you've got it for councils, because those big event council meetings, which are every month, are they? I think.
It's a very good question. No, I'm not suggesting that in the slightest. I mean, councillors have always been treated different to MPs, MSPs and so on. Whether that's right or wrong, I think, is a much bigger debate. I would just note a contradiction there, however, in how some councillors are being treated. They may have that stipulation, yet some are also being allowed to contribute remotely and those kinds of things. So I think there's kind of a contradiction there in how they're being dealt with. I think more generally, what our representatives do at all levels, I think, is worthy of debate, however, but that's probably not for this moment.
Certainly not for the passage of evidence for this bill. Ben, Alistair, Nick, can I thank you very much for your attendance today. If there are thoughts that come to you after this, please feel free to reach out and write to us, and we'll take that. And similarly, I hope should we have questions, you will reciprocate in a response unlike Mr Schwarzenegger, who's not on the witness list for this bill, perhaps from Graham's point of view, unfortunately. But can I thank you for your attendance today, and I'll just suspend this meeting for a change of panel. Thank you. Can I welcome everyone back to the second panel session to the committee hearing today, and we're joined by Annabel Mullen, who's joining us online, who's Director of Communications from Electa. Good morning. Juliet Swan, who's Nations and Regions Programme Manager for Transparency International UK, and Willie Sullivan, who's Director of the Electoral Reform Society in Scotland. Can I welcome you all this morning? If you wish to answer a question, and I always put out the prefix, there's no necessity to do so, but if you can place R in the chat or just indicate to me and I will bring people in. We're also continuingly being joined by Graham Simpson MSP, who is the sponsoring member for this bill. I'm happy if all are just going to kick straight off to questions from the panel, and I was going to start with that overarching question of, do we support a recall mechanism for MSPs? And Annabel, if I can come to you first. And
thank you. Yes. I don't know how much you all know about the work of Electa, and I just slightly wanted to contextualise and introduce us to give you a sort of sense of kind of why we might be speaking the way we are. So I'm Dr. Annabel Mullen. I've been with Electa for about 9 months, but I've worked with them for about 5 years. Our work is about women. At the core of that is about equipping women to stand for election and then once in office to thrive. We manage and deal with a lot of the barriers that women and minorities face within sort of anything that they do in terms of reaching out to elected office. And we've listened to women for many years, nearly a decade now, and that's thousands of women, and we're very informed by that. And I would say that what we offer is the lived experience of women's experience in politics, and that's the angle and I suppose our contribution to this work. Broadly, recalls are and can be a positive. There are enormous caveats to that, and that's something that I'd probably like to speak to as we go on through this session. But I think they can provide, and we're very keen on this, accountability, transparency. They can provide a place where women can take part actively in the recall position. They can empower that democratic participation. They can encourage improvement in ethical standards, which has a reach for also improving treatment of women within the system itself. However, and there are quite a lot of howevers, is that they can expose women to disproportionate political risk. And I think that's something that I'd probably like to speak to as we move through the panel today.
We'll come to that very specific point later in my little group, but thank you for that. And it's right to say that you are a party political with regard to your support for women seeking election and support therein.
Yeah, we are absolutely non-partisan. We train and work with women of all parties and none, and we support independent candidates. And obviously there is a piece around this discussion that speaks particularly to that.
Thank you. Juliet, can I come to you?
So hi, good morning everyone. I'm happy to be here. I guess, at TI UK, we're concerned that trust in politics and politicians is declining, and so we're interested in ways that this can be restored and see recall as part of a package of measures which can improve transparency and restore trust. I don't think on its own it can necessarily do that. It does provide public accountability for members whose behaviour undermines the integrity of the role of an MSP and of the Parliament outside of general elections. I think, polling tells us politicians aren't meeting the standards of behaviour that the public expect, nor are they, and the public don't think that politicians are held to account for failures of integrity. So I guess recall can act as a reminder to members of the need to respect codes of conduct and standards of integrity and serve as a deterrent to failures of integrity, but it can also be a way for the public to feel that they can hold politicians to account in transparent and effective ways that are not rigged. So I guess whilst we support recall, it does need to be a system that works in an understandable and effective way and really delivers on what the public perceive to be a fair process that provides sufficient sanction for proven failures. And I guess that would be my sort of overwhelming message, is that what are you trying to achieve and on whose behalf? And if it's a public perception issue, then it has to meet those high standards of what the public would expect to be a fair and accountable process.
Excellent, thank you. Willie, I'll go to you for...
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for asking us to come and speak to you today. Yeah, I think ERS support in principle recall. Again, it's about the detail of how those principles are met, you know, we believe that these sort of standards, regulations, sanctions should be considered guardrails to help elected representatives to be the best versions of themselves as often as possible. We're all human, but I feel the primary principle of recall must be an attempt to address the distrust and delegitimisation of the democratic system caused sometimes when representatives, not the only cause of course, when representatives act in ways that make voters believe that they're not held to a particularly high standard. And I think that primary principle is a useful test when you're looking at other more imbalanced questions like regional, you know, how do you do that on a regional list in the Scottish system, for example? You know, so the first principle is the best one to test it against, I think.
Yeah. So maintain that first principle that's about an agreed standard of behaviour, that if you fall below, one of the consequences would be potentially a recall and the loss of your ability to represent the people who sent you there, which is the bit that underpins this.
Sure, and they see that your behaviour leads to the fact that you're no longer in a position to represent them.
Yeah, excellent. I suppose and this comes, I think, to what you were hinting at, Annabelle, and I'll come to you first on this. Do you think there's a risk with this bill that there are some MSPs that are in essence going to be disproportionately targeted? It may, you know, certainly not deliberate intent of the bill, but what do you see as the level of risk of a sort of disproportionate approach, particularly, you know, to women, to underrepresented backgrounds being the subject of this compared to others? What are the concerns that you have at Elect Her? I'll come to you, Annabelle. Sorry.
Thank you, yeah. Takes a little time for my mute to go. I think the things that really strike us is that, you know, and a thread throughout our work is that women politicians are more likely to face politically motivated action. And, you know, in an extreme version of that, we suggest could end up being a recall or a removal attempt. We don't have any examples of that specifically in our national experience. But internationally, if you look at something that occurred in Colorado, where a senator was recalled, and that was over a very specific political point that position that she had, and that the recall campaign did use gendered rhetoric and tactics. So I think there are examples internationally where that becomes a piece of this, and that is obviously a concern. I think there are ways that we can mitigate that within the bill. But it is certainly something that concerns us. There is also the suggestion that there might be some undermining of the affirmative action work that Scotland has particularly been, you know, at the forefront of, you know, in our country. And that's been incredibly impressive, but there is concern that recalls might be misused, I think, and that would then undermine a lot of that good work. So I suppose it comes down to kind of disproportionate targeting of female politicians, political weaponisation potentially, and then I think broadly the discouragement from actually seeking public office, concerns that this public scrutiny that's linked to recalls might be more overwhelming towards women. I think sort of establishing a basis of trust and demonstrating a real thought and care around this would be one way that you could try and ensure that wasn't a really big problem. I think the other thing that we've noticed is that when you look at a comparison of pre and post introduction of the recall, it does suggest that the prospect of a recall petition can play a role in encouraging suspended MPs to resign preemptively. Now, that obviously can be both good and bad. Where our concern lies with that is if the sort of process of understanding what has occurred and the process hasn't run through, and women are under sort of some duress or stress, then they might fall under and resign preemptively when it wasn't actually necessary. So I think there's a sort of some cautionary provisions, but I think, again, that we can put in some recommendations for what I describe as gender-sensitive implementation. And that might be about principal monitoring the gendered use of this bill, so to understand the sort of data evaluation of it. I think there's also anti-discrimination provisions that potentially could be added in. But those are some of the things we were thinking would be actionable outcomes that could improve and potentially protect and mitigate.
So there is a concern there, but you have a level of confidence that with amendment and structure that could be offset and protected against, and certainly the monitoring of it would allow, if necessary, the return to it. Thank you. Juliet, can I come to you?
Yeah, I think for us, it's that you don't want to just have this sort of one blunt instrument of recall. It has to be, as I was saying, part of a package of accountability measures. So that it's about how the whole ecosystem works and how members perform within that and perform their role within it without it just being this one sort of weapon. So I think things like further improvements to lobbying transparency, further steps to be transparent about potential conflicts of interest, better rules maybe around, for example, gifts and hospitality, making sure they're meeting the expectations of the public, because I think then you're creating an environment where integrity is at the forefront rather than relying on just sort of, which, as Annabelle says, a step that can be weaponized, and we have seen that in places like Taiwan and California as well. I think importantly, to really try and depoliticize the process, we think it's really important to consider adding lay members to the Standards Committee, because that would mean that you weren't just making political party choices, that you were helped and assisted in those choices and the recommendations that you made by members of the public who would apply to stand, much as happens in Westminster, and indeed as the Senedd in Wales has recommended should happen on their Standards Committee. One of the other things that we think would help, and as Annabelle says, especially with sort of almost a chilling effect on whether people even decide to run, is that the sanctions should be clear, and the imposition of sanctions, sort of how that might work, so that you go into it with your eyes open. Yeah, I have some other thoughts, but I'll leave it there for now.
I'm sure we'll come and address. Willie, can I come to you? Concerns about sort of the risk with regard to underrepresented and particularly women, I suppose the politicisation of a process?
I think having that up there is a big question. I think it's really important, and in the political culture, I've spoken to quite a few women MSPs and other female politicians, and just the climate out there in the culture. I think we need to recognise that is there, and that any sort of legislation like this is taking account of it and putting in place the checks and balances and measures that Annabelle spoke about.
Yeah. I suppose, flowing on from that, my next question is, part of this is also a public understanding of what this is about. What sort of public awareness do we need to have in place for this to work successfully, without people misunderstanding it, potentially applying a very personal, maybe even personal political view towards someone, rather than as a step because the behaviour choices have fallen below that which we think is acceptable for an elected member. I mean, Annabelle, if I come to you first on that.
So I think what's interesting about this is looking at what's occurred with the recalls that we've had in Westminster over the last sort of few years, is that the general public do have a good sense of what it is and what it means. And the perception is that there's a transparency there that they like and appeal to. I think the issue is that political parties have often misused the recall process. And I know in the last panel you spoke to sort of finances and the piece around that. That's a huge part of the barriers to entry for women generally. Recall petitions are expensive. There's a lot required of them, a lot of resource required of them. Those are things that women are broadly barriered, and particularly minoritized women. But I think that has to come into that. And that also means they don't have the capacity to then speak to the public. A general knowledge campaign, I mean, one of our sort of levers of change to fix the system is broadly about bringing in more education at the younger years, and indeed curriculum education. If we could have that as part of the process, that would make all our lives easier. However, I don't think we're necessarily going to get that. But I think in addition to introducing this, there must be some time and cost-effective communication set aside to ensure that people understand its purpose and intent, and within the bill itself there are protections put in place, because misuse would be a grave and would really go against what the core point of this is, it seems to me.
If I can just push back on that slightly, in a sense, I think what you're talking about is the requirement for an educated electorate, which, you know, on some circumstances we can say that there are challenges on that, particularly when we start talking about disabled or ethnic minority candidates and the views that people take. You're talking about school. Is there anything in relation to the proposals about the recall system itself that you think should be specifically targeted by way of education, in a sense, or actually, unless everything else is put right, it's almost, you know, blowing in the wind, the speech?
I think that potentially, and this might be more of a seat rather than a clear and obvious comms, but the induction process when someone becomes an MSP, and indeed at the councillor level, but the clarity around inductions, a repetition and refresher sessions on inductions and what it means, I think those are really important, and it comes up repeatedly that inductions are often light touch and not, there's not enough emphasis as people continue through their career as an elected member, and that issue means that they're not always entirely aware of all of the caveats. And I think that is something that we would stress as part of this. And I think potentially there is a piece around providing more institutional support for just a general knowledge, and maybe there's an argument for women leaders to have some additional support if they are facing.
So again, both the clarity of message, clarity of expectation, and revisiting that so that it is both remembered and then can be tested perhaps by an individual member when circumstances, where they have concern about circumstances.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
And I mean, an annual refresher would be
Willie, can I come to you about that sort of, well, both the public education side, but also member elected individuals education side?
Yeah, I think the public are not going to really pay attention till it happens, really, and that's when they find out about it. That's the opportunity to kind of explain it. I think one of the things about that is the sanctions have to be as clear as possible. Now, that's pretty straightforward when it's a criminal conviction, or, as is proposed, absenteeism, I guess. Bit more messy, but then when you have like suspension from the House on whatever the issue is, that is kind of probably pretty opaque to the public. So I think just attempts to make that process as clear as possible, and that's where it's going to become a bit politicised as well. It's probably always going to be a bit politicised, but I think the clarity is crucial. As I said at the beginning, I think offering standards, explaining as possible what standards are expected, and the possible sanctions always help people to stay to the standards. So I think getting members, up to speed on that through inductions or continually remind. Again, it will be pretty well highlighted if anybody is ever recalled. That's when the attention. That's when everybody will learn about it, really. So, but let's hope that doesn't ever have to happen. But I think it's necessary in case it does happen, because that's when trust gets further eroded if nothing's done about it.
So actually, you're supporting what Annabelle says about, from the individual elected individual's point of view, that clarity of understanding of the expectation, the consequences that would flow from it. And then the reality is it's only when that interfaces with the public will the opportunity exist to educate the public.
I think so.
More about the process as much as the cause for getting there.
Yeah.
Juliet.
Yeah, I would definitely agree on improving induction, especially around integrity and code of conduct and the Nolan principles. I think that's really important. And as Annabel says, in delivering it again and again, obviously, you know, when you're newly elected, you're faced with a lot of information in one go. So just making sure that you really understand that and supporting MSPs to sort of really live up to those standards of integrity. And then I think from both the public and from members' perspective, that the processes just have to be clear and independent and provide, you know, opportunities for appeal, so that it's harder to play party politics with it, or indeed allow financial interests to play their part. And I think, again, I'll come back to just sort of, if you introduce new accountability tools, they have to be seen to be delivering, or else the public will just think, well, you're just trying to mess with us again. So I think it has to be perceived as effective, as not as a rigged system, and that you can't therefore overcomplicate it. So I think one of the things that we've said, both in our submission here and to the Senedd, was, you know, just a consistent approach is helpful. I mean, I think the public are very good at understanding that there are different layers of elections that they're taking part in. But I think when you bring in accountability mechanisms, it's really helpful if they can be consistent across the piece, so that you don't think people are being held to different standards in different institutions.
So even if the vehicle is different, if the MOT applies to all of them, that
I
gives
can't
confidence.
Drive, so I don't know.
Oh, there we are. That's a very good thing. Sue, can I pass over to you?
Thank you very much, Convener. Do you think the design of the recall process that's been proposed in this bill will do a good job of balancing the different considerations around the equal treatment of regional and constituency MSPs in terms of when you consider how they're initially elected as well? Do you want to go first, Willie?
Yeah, I mean, I think it obviously is a consideration to try and balance that as much as possible, though I don't think it is that possible. And therefore come back to the initial principle about how do we maintain trust and legitimacy in the process, and that might mean that you have to treat the regional members slightly different than the constituency members, and that's a shame and it's not ideal. But if we go back to the first principle, then that might be where you end up.
Yeah, Annabel, you're nodding away. I come to yourself.
No, I'm just agreeing with Willie's point, really. It's just that sort of, it is so different. It is very complex. But I think, as Juliet was saying, it's really about the fairness and being demonstrably fair and transparent about that fairness. I think that's, people would like to feel that as much as possible.
The panel before Juliet sort of mentioned that it could be seen as a stitch-up if it just goes, like the regional list was just to go to the next person on that list. Their words, not mine. And I suppose if you think about, you spoke at the very outset about the transparency in politicians in general. So what are your thoughts around that?
So I think a few things. One, I think at the end of the day, whilst the constituency and the regional elections are different, once you're here in your position as a member of the Scottish Parliament and as an individual. And I think it's important in a way to separate that the processes are different, but once you're here, you're all equal. I think the idea of... So at TI, we struggle a little bit, yes, with the whole sort of recall and replace concept on the regional list. I understand why it's attractive, and I understand how it sort of reflects what happens when people resign or pass away, and it goes to the next list. But I think when we've had recall by-elections at Westminster frequently, it's been a change of party as well as a change of individual, and sometimes there can be party connotations that have led to the member being in the position that they're in, or the way the party has behaved in relation to the member being sanctioned. I'm thinking of things like the Owen Paterson was sanctioned and the Conservatives tried to whip to get the vote to not go against him in Parliament and the House of Commons. So I think it's to allow the public a full opportunity to express their feelings about the representative, I think requires something more than just following the standard principle of how the regional list works. And as Willie said, that is complicated, and it means that there will be slight differences between how it works, but I guess that's the nature of a multi-member system, and we have to accept that and try and work with it. Yeah. I don't want to be the person making that work, by the way, that would be.
Well, that's just it. Without coming to, do you think the fact that we're even considering just taking the next on the list is like maybe perhaps being a bit lazy in our trying to find a solution? Lazy might not be the right word, but it's the easiest.
I mean, certainly when I was first considering it, I mean, we do, obviously in Scotland we use a single transferable vote in our local government elections, and when there is a by-election there, we do go ahead and use the alternative vote to elect replacements. I mean, that's not perfect. Willie can probably talk a little bit more about that. But I think, again, it comes down to what would the public perceive to be a fair and transparent way of deciding who should be dismissed and who should replace them, or should they be re-elected or whatever. And I think I feel, obviously it's hard to tell because we've never seen it happen, right? So I feel that the public would find that to be slightly, yeah, a stitch up is a good way of putting it. I mean, because the party doesn't suffer, right? And they might have had a role to play in something that happened. And I think as well, just of all of the potential anyway, yeah, there are loads of
complicated. I think that's what you're saying. Willie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the perception is that if it goes to the next person on the list, then that is, it's dodgy in some way. Then I think we really need to consider if it is an AV referendum for the whole AV election for the whole of the region. I mean, I think that would be
okay.
And there's all that messes with the proportionality, but I think coming back to that fundamental principle about trust, and I don't know. I'm just telling you what I mean. You said that other people have said that might be an issue. I can understand how it might be an issue, but if it's not, if moving to the next person on the list doesn't impact in any significant way on legitimacy, then I think that's the easiest way to do it. But then that is different from having a by-election in a constituency.
Yeah.
Does that not go back to the fundamental question about what the recall's for? Because the principle of the recall would appear to be the ability for the electorate to remove an individual whose behaviour has fallen below whatever the acceptable.
Yeah.
What we seem to be talking about now, actually, is the purpose of the recall is to potentially allow a current snapshot of the electorate's view of political parties and who governs the country. And the expense of that is the individual, but also the expense of that is then removing this process from holding an elected individual to account on their behaviour and then reflecting more what people would want by way of a general election.
Well, I think it's about whether the first step is the individual removed, right? So I mean, and that's through a 10%.
Whatever.
Whether you should replace that individual, I guess, is a question to be asked, because we're lucky in that we have another 6 members in that area represent. Well, yeah.
There are other representatives in that area.
Yeah. So you could conclude that we don't need to. The motivation to maintain trust is just for that person to go, and they don't have to be replaced until the next election.
Juliet's wanting to come in as well.
Yes,
and then
I think
back.
I think Emma's got a question as well. That's it.
Yeah,
Juliet.
just very quickly on not replacing at all, which is certainly something that we've considered TI UK, that it's just be a remove and then wait till the next election. Yeah. And I certainly, when I was sort of thinking through all the possibilities, so say you're a regional member, you have been found to have breached the code of conduct, there's been a sanction, it's been voted for by the Parliament, you're subject to a recall in the region, it goes to the 10%, but the party have suspended you. You're an independent now. Normally, if you're an independent on the list and you're not re-elected, or you're you die or you refuse to resign, that just stays vacant. So maybe that is...
I know there's some questions coming to that on the vacancies. Annabelle, do you want to come in on my... I can't remember what my original question was.
I would... I was only just going to say that obviously there is that positioning around, I mean, this is not really our area of expertise, but there is that positioning around what happens when an independent candidate within the regional, and as Juliet says, it's an empty place, and that is sort of the expected way for it to be. And maybe there is a perception, and I mean, I suspect you could find some answers to this with some focus groups and maybe some Qualtrics quantitative kind of follow-up to understand people's views of where they see and what their perception is, because that allows for a sort of, understanding of people's trust around this particular part of it.
On this, and then Willie wants to come in. So,
that's okay,
well, Willie, do you want to come back in, then I'll pass back to Sue.
Yeah, just to say that I think leaving the constituency empty is different from leaving a regional list empty. So, yeah.
I think as our evidence is that we're all quite aware that we do have to accept as regional and constituent, there is a difference on how we're elected, and therefore the accepting that it will be different and how we progress from there. We've received a lot of evidence that the cost of running the recall process for a regional MSP could be about 2.5 million. And do you think, therefore, that this cost is justifiable based on the additional accountability the recall process is intended to deliver? So it's like cost-benefit analysis, if you think. You've already mentioned there's 7 other representatives for those individuals. So what do you think? If I come to yourself first, Juliet, because I've got your eye.
I mean, democracy isn't cheap, but is it worth the price? Mm-hmm. I think that's a decision that is above my pay grade. Yeah, if you decide that you are going to introduce accountability mechanisms that start to bring the public into the process, then there is going to be a cost associated with that. And I guess, as I was saying at the outset, we definitely see this as part of a package of measures. So maybe, you could weigh it up and go, well, actually, these measures are more cost effective and this is very expensive. But then again, what will the public perceive to be, an adequate way to hold people accountable when they fall below the standards that are expected of them?
And back to the convener's point about what's the purpose of the bill. So, Willie?
Is that figure just for the recall petition?
It's the recall process, I think so.
Is it for the election as well?
Yeah, it's for both, 2.5 million.
Right, yeah. I mean, to me, and this would have to be tested, but the public, I think, would perceive that as a lot. And I think breaking out from that, how much it would cost just for the member to be removed without the election might be interesting. So, 2.5 million. I mean, I think it might backfire in that going like, okay, yeah, we want to get this person removed, but they will spend 2.5 million in public money.
Yeah, the perception again is a bit. Again, that's all. Annabelle, before I move.
I don't have anything particular further to add. I know that Peterborough, they estimated it was about 500,000, but obviously it's a different kettle of fish running that when they did the recall petition there.
Thanks. I don't think it convener.
Yeah. Thank you. Emma, do I want to come to you about
Thanks, convener. I wanted to pick up, Willie, on your suggestion of an AV election to replace a regional vacancy. That would mean that we're in the situation of having 3 separate voting systems in one, and we can and do argue that 2 is too many. So at that point, what would your thoughts be on just rerunning a D'Hondt ballot and aligning that final seat with what goes to the picture most closely?
Through this conversation, I'm coming to the conclusion that it's probably better not to have an election. And I was just I was throwing in the AV as if you had to have an election, and if you concluded that an election was necessary, then that would probably be the way to do it. Running D'Hondt. Do you mean?
So run D'Hondt as if you were doing the full list, see how different the list is and what that last party makes most sense to be.
Right. you could also do that. If you were deciding you were going to, and it would be cheaper, right?
Probably the same price. Easier to count.
Yeah, I think if you were going to have an election, I would say I think it's probably I'm coming down on the side. It's probably not a good idea to have an election. Then I think clarity would be important. So, AV might be a better option in that case.
Okay, interesting. My next question is for Annabelle, just on this idea of having a regional election to replace somebody who's been removed through recall. Given that at the moment, when parties implement equalities mechanisms for their candidates, it's most often done through the regional list. Do you have concerns that getting rid of that part would result in a less representative parliament?
Yeah, it's certainly one of the things that we sort of have on our the cons part of this is that any sort of associated measures around affirmative action or quotas will be particularly badly affected by this piece, and whether or not we can implement some guidance or even more some requirements for there to be a gendered element if that has been the original individual. Because we don't want to, remove the affirmative action frameworks that have been, put in place. It's hard enough anyway to get us to equality. It's definitely something we're concerned about. I suspect it's quite hard. We're struggling anyway to get parties to implement different measures. But if required by a bill, that will always focus mine somewhat, which would be our, where we'd like it to be.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Rona, can I pass over to you?
Thank you, and good morning. I want to ask the question that I asked the first panel, which is about disqualification for non-attendance. Now, the first panel seemed to suggest they didn't think it necessarily should be in this bill, that it didn't really fit so well. So I kind of wanted to ask your view on that. And also, do you think it's fair that hybrid participation isn't included in the, having one appearance in 180 days sort of thing? Willie, come to you first.
I think if there's, with lots of caveats, if MSPs don't come to do a big part of their job, which is to legislate, then I think the public would have concerns about that, and I think the public would know about it, because that's there'd be politics and media around it. So I think with lots of steps of trying to find out what's going on for that person, trying to give them the right to explain why they're not able to come, and even a right of appeal, I think it might be useful to have a way of removing them in such circumstances.
Okay, yeah. So clearly there's a difference between ill health and misconduct, So and it's just to sort of try and tease out whether you think the bill is explicit enough in the separation of that. Juliet, would you like to answer?
So again, I think it comes back to what is the problem that this is seeking to solve. I guess speaking from a purely sort of anti-corruption organisation perspective, the corruption risk here depends on what activity is replacing attendance at Parliament. So if that activity could present a conflict of interest, obviously then it should be declared in the Members' Register of Interests. So, that's sort of puts that to one side. I think another consideration is how an elected member chooses to perform their role and allocate their time is largely up to that person. And I think it's notable that when members of the House of Lords have been removed for non-attendance, it is frequently due to ill health. And obviously it's a different process and you can't resign. But I do think there will have to be adequate protections in place to ensure the full picture of non-attendance is available and that people aren't punished or somehow targeted for being unwell. Yeah. And again, and I'm sure that Annabelle can speak to this, we do see this happening more with women politicians than not. You know, people who are responsible for childcare or who have different health conditions. I haven't come to a settled position on this, you were pleased to know. So that, if one of the challenges the committee is seeking to address is public perception of politicians, then obviously visibility in the Parliament is a metric that the public find easy to see as tangible proof of members playing an active role. And then I guess my final point, which actually came up, my colleague gave evidence to the UK Standards Committee on outside interests earlier this week, which is a sort of similar area of interest to do with, you know, what is a conflict of interest and what is a conflict of attention, which is a principle that they're interested in developing. But I also do think something that was said in that meeting, and I, you know, offer this information without any opinion, attendance doesn't necessarily determine the quality of the contributions.
Okay, thank you. Annabelle, yeah, Juliet mentioned, you know, caring responsibilities, which is often a reason why, you know, elected members can't attend. And so I'd like your thoughts on that. And also, you know, does the bill give enough, as it stands, does the bill give enough weight to, you know, privacy and confidentiality in terms of a person's personal circumstances? Be keen for your view on that.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that play into this. From a sort of organisational perspective, we are very keen for 21st century democracy to represent, you know, all people, and flexibility has to be baked into that, because otherwise those who have caring responsibilities struggle to be able to be played a part. And it's a really big piece of why women and minoritised women don't get involved, is because they cannot balance those demands. And in order to encourage and ensure that they can, you know, do that. And we all know, having been through a pandemic, having understood hybrid working, having understood virtual working, that we have the capacity and the capabilities to make this work. And I think at the moment, the bill does not provide that contextualisation. And, you know, I think the general public have a view that if you are, just as Julia said, if you are providing the quality of the work, I'm not sure whether you need to necessarily be present, as long as your presence is making an impact. And I think at the moment, having that sort of really defined piece around flexibility and hybrid working within, if it continues to be within the bill, that piece would be absolutely fundamental, because at the moment the greyness leaves open a great deal of questions, and I suspect that women will end up on the hard end of that. As we've seen before. I was with some MPs this week talking about the impact of voting, and it still amazes me, and it's totally ridiculous that you cannot vote remotely when you are representing constituencies in Scotland and in Wales, in Westminster. I mean, it is just an extraordinary piece.
Well, we can do that, thankfully. We can do that
I know.
Here. But I mean, I think it begs the wider question of whether this is a fit in this bill for that. I mean, it certainly is a precedent with councillors that law already exists about their attendance. But I think now that we've moved on to more hybrid working, and I think it needs a closer look as to whether that this would fit in this bill, and whether it would be possibly an invasion of a person's rights to say, well, you've not been here. You know, taking ill health or mental health out of it, caring responsibilities, or a myriad of other reasons could stop them from attending. Exactly. So, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
So, is there a challenge in the reality that the bill has an objective assessment, say, the example of attendance? I mean, there may be others that are put forward that are, in essence, conduct, internal within the Parliament Code of Conduct, that then when you apply the subjective reality of the individuals who fulfil the roles of MSPs, it is very hard to reconcile a stark objective rule, you must be here once in 180 days, with the reality of it, given that if someone did want to, no MSP would ever choose to, or no elected official would ever choose to game the system, the ability to turn up once takes you out of the spotlight. But what the subjective reality perhaps of an individual's life puts them into the spotlight when it shouldn't be there. If I come to you first, Annabelle, and then I'll come to you, Juliet.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think no one goes into this lightly, and I don't believe that MSPs would wish not to be in attendance, because most go into this wanting to play their part, wanting to be diligent, wanting to. But we all know that life has an extraordinary way of throwing curveballs at us, and those who are required to be in caring positions or indeed in positions of financial hardship, it is harder. What I suppose the bill can respond to that with, there are provisions that can be made to ensure that there is thought given to, extenuating and extraordinary circumstances. But I think making it very clear, sort of that process will occur before it is taken to the extreme, and that is, and that will also happen transparently. And that alleviates the trust element, but also it allows people to have, because it is another big issue for us, is women's exposure and women's exposure on social media and the problems that all of that brings to this role and this work. So yes, if we can find ways to mitigate that and to be really clear and transparent within the bill, that would help to make it, if this element remains.
It does feel like a little bit of a blunt instrument for trying to deal with what could be a very complicated series of situations, right? I think probably trying to understand what is preventing someone from attending would be, I mean, in a workplace, right? That if you're a good manager, that's what you do, right? You say, you haven't been attending for a while, let's sit down and talk about why that is. Rather than immediately moving to, dismissal or some kind of other sanction. I think as well that this is, again, where it comes down to sort of what are the other integrity measures that are in place around the Parliament, because, is it, if the only failing you have is non-attending, is that, where does that sit amongst all of the other sort of expected conduct and expected integrity behaviours? Again, I think probably if this persists, I would definitely say that having lay members on this committee considering whether the punishment was appropriate would be required, both for getting that real life sort of experience, putting that into the thing, and also, again, avoiding politicisation of the process. And I just would go back to the original question I posed, which is I'm not 100% sure what the problem is we're trying to solve here. I know there is a specific instance that we could refer to, and a couple of other maybe borderline instances, but I would hate to legislate for something so broad based on an individual's behaviour. I don't think that's a particularly good way to legislate.
Willie, any comment?
I think everything that Annabelle and Juliet said is important, and I guess we've just got to balance that with the extreme possibility that somebody might become an MSP and then go and live in the south of Spain, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I guess it's balancing. I mean, there's loads of checks and balances that you can put in place to make sure that nobody's being unfairly treated through it. But I think there is also a little bit of a risk, very small risk, but there's a risk that might happen.
Thank you. Graham, is there anything that is occasioned questions from you?
Just a reflection, really. I would encourage members, if they haven't already, to read the policy memorandum, which covers quite a lot of the ground, and it will show that I've given deep thought to some of the questions that have already been raised. And I know I'll be questioned in a few weeks' time, but if individual members want to come and speak to me in advance of that, if they feel it's appropriate, my door is open to discuss these matters in detail, and I shall leave it at that. And
that offer is now on the record, Graham. Thank you. Can I thank the witnesses for attending today and for the evidence that you've given? If there are thoughts afterwards that come to you, please feel free to correspond with the committee, and I hope you wouldn't mind if we reciprocate should we have questions. But can I again thank you for your attendance, particularly you, Annabelle, remotely. I'm glad it worked as well as it did, and it shows that hybrid working can work properly. So can I thank you, and I will now bring to an end the public part of this meeting.